Hi, I'm Gareth Edwards. I'm a film director, and I'm very honored to be sharing with you just a few personal stories about some of the amazing films on TCM this June and why they mean so much to me. So as a kid, every week my dad would go down the local video store and we'd bring back a classic film that he loved as a child, and he'd try to explain to me its place in cinema history. And one week he came home and he said, "Okay, Gareth, this film here, this is the greatest film ever made." And my eyes lit up and he went, "It's not Star Wars. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly."
You see, in this world, there's two kinds of people, my friend. Those with loaded guns and those who dig. You dig.
I remember the year that I left school, I had this big decision to make. You either go and do an academic career at college, or you leave and pursue the dream of becoming a filmmaker. And I always felt like I was going to let my parents down by not doing an academic subject. And that summer we went on holiday to Spain, and it just so happened we went to the very location that they shot The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in Almeria. And so one day, me and my dad, we went on this little trip together, and we went and visited the actual locations. And having watched the film, you started to be able to dissect it and realize how the director had put all these shots together, and there was no interior set. They were using the exterior, became the interior, and it was all one and the same. So you could really sort of get a feel for how these sequences were made. And it was very inspiring. And to see my dad's face, who was so excited, it felt like he was at Mecca or something. And it made me realize that maybe filmmaking had parental approval and I wasn't totally wasting my life. So that summer I chose to become a filmmaker, point blank. So when I got my first job, I didn't have anywhere to stay, and so the studio put me in this really nice hotel in Santa Monica called the Huntley, and it was kind of my home for quite a long time when I was making my first movie. And then during the pandemic, I sat and watched Point Blank again and realized that there's this whole section of that film all set in the Huntley, in this place I lived in for ages. And so when I went back there to stay again, I said, "Can I speak to the manager?" This guy came along, and there was this woman, and I was like, "Have you ever seen Point Blank?" And they kind of looked at me like, "What?" And I said, "Look, Lee Marvin, there's this whole section in the film that's like this big set piece where, features your hotel, and Lee Marvin runs through here, he goes up those steps, and there's a big chase and all sorts of things." And I was like, "You should have a plaque, or a statue or something about that movie." And they just looked at me like I was crazy.
Cell. Prison cell. How did I get here?
John Boorman, who directed Point Blank, is a very underrated director, as a lot of British film directors are. And he went on to direct films like Deliverance. He was also set up to make Lord of the Rings. And when that fell through, he ended up turning a lot of those ideas into Excalibur. And James Cameron even admits that The Emerald Forest, which he also directed, was a big influence and inspiration for Avatar. And so this was his first film, his first real studio film of any kind. And it was right out the gate, he made an instant classic.
You my pa?
Of course I ain't your pa. I'll get you some relish.
Paper Moon. A few years ago, I made a film called The Creator, which at its heart was a parent-child relationship. And so I decided to revisit all the classic films that had that kind of dynamic. And it doesn't take long at all until you hit Paper Moon. It's probably got the best performances ever in that kind of category. And Tatum O'Neal, who's the little girl actress in the film, she actually won an Oscar, and she was only 10 years old for Best Supporting Actress, even though in reality she was the lead actress. And it makes even more sense when you learn that Ryan O'Neal was her real-life dad. Maybe the fact that it was shot on black and white, it definitely felt like an instant classic.
Well, we're in Missouri anyway.
What do we do now? Drop some 20s?
Forbidden Planet. My generation obviously was very much inspired by people like Spielberg and Joe Dante. And the thing those films had in common was all the kids in them would sit and watch these sort of 1950s and 1960s kind of sci-fi B-movies. And so I started trying to watch those films to see if I could become like my hero filmmakers. And every time I bought one, you do a bit of research and it'd be like, "Oh, there's a better one, it's called this." And then you get another one, "Oh, there's a better one called this." And eventually it would lead you to the best one of all, which was called Forbidden Planet.
Where have you been? I've beamed and beamed. Sorry, miss. I was giving myself an oil job.
Now, apparently, Arthur C. Clarke showed Forbidden Planet to Stanley Kubrick before they began making 2001. And although Kubrick wasn't crazy impressed, it definitely must have had an influence on Arthur C. Clarke, because when you look at some of the ingredients, essentially there's these alien relics found on another world. There is an AI entity that is threatening the lives potentially of crew members. And there's also this alien artifact that is allowing humans to have the power of a god. You can see all the influence that this film had on the science fiction that was later to follow. It was clearly the kind of guiding light for Star Trek, the original series, in all sorts of ways, most notably in the devices that the crew stand in just before the ship comes into land. That's very similar to Kirk and Spock, when they would beam down onto a planet in the original show. And also, I think it must have been quite a subconscious influence, at least on George Lucas, in the fact that the film opens with this yellow text against the stars of space, kind of bent with their perspective backwards, which is very much like the original trilogy. Godzilla versus Hedorah. Before I started working on Godzilla in 2012, I ended up doing this trip to Japan for an event. And as I was leaving, I just noticed my shoelaces untied and started tying it up. And I felt this tap on my shoulder. I looked round, and it was this very kind, old-looking gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Banno, and I realized it was Yoshimitsu Banno, who had directed Godzilla vs. Hedorah, otherwise known as the Smog Monster. So I ended up spending this amazing day with him, where he told me all these old stories, and at one point we sat down at a table, and he slid this book across to me, and it was a Western book, so I could read the cover, and it was entitled The Worst Movies Ever Made. And I thought, oh no, and I opened it up. And yeah, lo and behold, there was a whole chapter called Godzilla vs. Hedorah. And I felt really bad, and I looked up at him, and he was just smiling, and he looked so proud that his film was in this book. And I totally understand it, because, I'm a great believer if some people in the world don't really hate your movie, then you're just not trying hard enough.